Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In this week's podcast, we turn to a text from the latter prophets, according to the Hebrew order of books, namely the book of Hosea, chapter 11. A segment of this chapter is well known among Christians, but that is not due to their familiarity with the prophets in general or Hosea in particular. Instead, the Gospel of Matthew has made this verse familiar by highlighting that Jesus' fleeing to Egypt and subsequently returning to Israelite territory was a fulfillment of prophecy. In Matthew chapter 2, verse 15, we find the operative reference. Jesus, of course, was an infant at the time. Wise men from the east had just come in their search for, quote-unquote, the King of the Jews. That's in verse 2 of chapter 2. Famously, these sages, sometimes called the Magi, had been directed by a star. While they were looking for this new king, the present king, namely Herod, became suspicious and even paranoid. No king sits by idly when another potential rival is lurking in the background, regardless of age or claim to the throne. Herod tells the wise men that he does not know where this alleged new king is, though everyone around agreed that the Messiah was supposed to be born in Bethlehem of Judea. That's in verse 5 of chapter 2. That messianic figure was supposed to be Israel's eventual new king, according to one strain of Jewish thought. Herod, feigning innocence, wishes the wise men well in their search, asking only that they inform him when they learn the child's location. Herod pretends that he also wants to worship this new king. Subsequently, the wise men continued their search by following the star again, and soon found Jesus as a reward for their efforts. That's in verse 11. They visited Mary, Jesus' mother, brought gifts, and worshipped the child. However, they did not return to Herod to tell him that their mission had been successful. Instead, they were warned in a dream to return to their country by another route. That's in verse 12. Herod's anxiety about this new king triggered another warning via another dream. This time, though, the recipient was Joseph, the man engaged to Mary. In the dream, he was warned that he had to get his wife and the baby out of town. Joseph arranged to take Mary and the baby into Egypt, where they could seek refuge. They stayed there until King Herod had died. It was a good thing, too, in that an enraged and jealous Herod had ordered the slaughter of every male baby in the area that was 2 years old or younger. That's in verse 16 of chapter 2 of the Gospel of Matthew. The irony of Herod's action is quite obvious. Egypt, in biblical lore, the house of bondage, and the place of slavery from which Israel once had to be rescued, now proved to be a safer place than traditional Israelite territory, in which a Jewish king now exercised power. Only when Herod had died was Joseph able to return home with Mary and Jesus. At this point, the Gospel of Matthew cites this as a fulfillment of the prophetic statement, "Out of Egypt have I called my son." That line occurs in the first verse of Hosea 11. The full text reads, "When Israel was a young man, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." The speaker here is God. Right off the bat, however, it is impossible not to notice a discrepancy. The son in this passage is not a messianic figure, or any other individual for that matter, but Israel the people. It was not uncommon to describe the relationship between God and Israel as that between a parent and a son or daughter. In fact, Israel was more often called a daughter than a son. In this particular chapter, however, the masculine imagery is used. Still, Hosea is talking about Israel as a community rather than as any individual, messianic or otherwise. Did the writer of Matthew simply misread this prophetic text? Not necessarily. One can surmise that the writer of the gospel envisions Jesus as the ultimate representative of Israel. In this sense, an individual is emblematic of a people. That would make the prophecy plausible. Nevertheless, that does not quite solve the problem. If first verse stood alone, there would be no difficulty. But the first verse begins a whole chapter, and the content of that chapter presents a huge problem. Why? Because throughout the rest of the chapter, Israel, God's son in the prophetic metaphor, is denounced for committing outrageous sins, including the sin of idolatry. The very next verse, in spite of vagaries in the Hebrew text in the first line, underscores Israel's persistently worshiping other deities. That's in verse 2 of chapter 11. After this denunciation, the deity emphasizes the efforts that had been made to teach Israel, called Ephraim in the third verse, by dealing with him tenderly as a child, providing for healing, leading the child with compassion and love, releasing the child from captivity, and feeding the child as well. That's in verses 3 and 4. In other words, the Israelite God has acted toward Israel as a caring parent, whether a father or mother, but to no avail. Israel's response to these ministrations was ignoring their own caring parent, that is, their own God, and engaging in idolatrous activities. How in the world could the writer of the Gospel of Matthew think a text outlining a life of sin, including idolatry, was referring to Jesus? It gets worse. The chapter also predicts pending judgment on Israel, which includes being subservient to Egypt and Assyria. That's in verse 5. Israel will soon be at the mercy of such superpowers, all because of their tendency of turning away from God. That's in verses 6 and 7. This is a standard passage that enumerates Israel's sins and the corresponding divine punishment, in this case, military defeat at the hand of Egyptian and Assyrian armies. Once again, the question is posed: how could a gospel writer think that such a text had anything at all to do with Jesus? This is most puzzling. Toward the end of Hosea, chapter 11, we get a glimpse into how emotional God becomes in dealing with such a wayward son. The deity says with great pathos, "How can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I hand you over, O Israel? How can I make you like Admah? How can I treat you like Zeboim?" That's in verse 8. In this plaintive self-questioning, God comes off as a distraught parent, knowing that the child needs to be disciplined, but hates being put in the position of administering that discipline. Of course, Ephraim and Israel are both common ways to refer to Israel as a people, as a community. This is not about an individual. It is about a collective, a gathering, a community. The other two names in this verse could not be more ominous. Admah and Zeboim are among the 5 cities in the Jordan Valley that were destroyed because of gross sin. Another 2 cities among this group are much more recognizable: Sodom and Gomorrah. That is how low Israel has sunk. God's elect people, is now comparable to cities who have become synonymous with pure evil. No wonder God is lamenting. The deity continues in this vein. My heart recoils within me. My compassion grows warm and tender. God is experiencing the same mixed emotions of a parent who is simultaneously terribly disappointed or even angered by the egregious behavior of a sinful child and overcome with emotion contemplating appropriate punishment. After this heart-wrenching display of consternation on God's part, the deity's love and compassion overcomes the anger. First, God forgoes any more punishment. The punishment was deserved, more than deserved, but punishment is not God's last word. Though there is difficulty in the Hebrew text, the sense is still clear. The time of divine anger and punishment is now over. All of a sudden, Israel will realize how gracious God has been and will now seek the Lord. They had been punished by Egyptian and Assyrian power. They will now leave those places and come home, both literally and spiritually. The Lord will assist Israel in this blessed return. That's in verse 11. And on that note, in the Hebrew version, the chapter ends right there with verse 11. Most commentators accuse the writer of the Gospel of Matthew of bending Hosea 11:1 to suit his purposes. He was not concerned with context, was uninterested in any original meaning, and was not daunted that no one would have seen this as a prophecy beforehand. The Gospel writer has ridden roughshod over this text, purely and simply. But paying closer attention to what is going on makes such an accusation not only premature, but quite off the mark. First off, it is curious that the Gospel at this juncture is citing the Hebrew textual tradition. Now that may seem at first unremarkable, but most of the citations and quotes of the Old Testament in the New Testament do not, in fact, follow the Hebrew textual tradition. Instead, they rely on Greek textual traditions, those that go under the collective name of the Septuagint. Jews translated Hebrew textual traditions into Greek about 250 years prior to Jesus' birth. This was primarily due to the growing influence of the Greek language as the result of the conquests of Alexander the Great. Greek was fast becoming a language that ordinary people could use in their everyday lives. By the time of Jesus, the general population was quite adept at Greek, which explains why the New Testament was written in Greek. This is the case even though the Romans, a Latin-speaking people, were now in occupation. The Gospel writers made use of the language to spread their message about Jesus. In fact, illustrating the importance of the Greek tradition to Matthew, he appealed to it in the famous prophecy about Jesus' virgin birth. This is where he cites Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. Quote, "Look, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and his name shall be called Emmanuel." And end of quote. In the Hebrew version of Isaiah, the word is young woman, as in a young woman will conceive. The Hebrew word is Alma. And indeed, in the context of Isaiah 7, the child who will be born to this young woman will soon grow up. However, before this child gets old enough to distinguish between what is good and what is bad, the threat that Israel is currently facing will have disappeared. That's in verses 15 through 17 of chapter 7. This is a salvation oracle by which God promises to protect Israel from foreign enemies. But the Gospel of Matthew is not interested in this Hebrew version. In this instance, the writer opts for a Greek tradition in which the word used was parthenos, with the nuance of not only a young woman, but a virgin. It becomes consequently a prophecy for Jesus' birth to a virgin woman. Clearly, the writer of Matthew's Gospel had access to both Greek and Hebrew traditions. In that period, there would have been no distinction between one text being better than another as it functioned as sacred scripture. This demonstrates a self-consciousness on the part of the writer of the Gospel. The Hebrew text of Hosea 11 had been chosen not by happenstance, but for the purpose of making sense of this part of the Jesus story. The reason for opting for the Hebrew tradition of Hosea is quite obvious. Hosea 11:1 in the Greek tradition refers to, quote-unquote, his children. The pronoun's antecedent is God, but in the Hebrew tradition, the speaker is God, who calls Israel my son. That text would allow the writer of the Gospel of Matthew to make the point that Jesus was simultaneously the embodiment of Israel and God's son. The Hebrew tradition was perfect for what the author of the Gospel had in mind. What about the rest of the chapter that rehearses Israel's persistent sin? How would Jesus fit into that context? This is what makes the Gospel of Matthew so brilliant in using this prophetic text. By applying Hosea 11, verse 1 to Jesus, the author draws two conclusions. 1, Jesus is God's Son. 2, Jesus is also the embodiment of Israel, who, as the people whom God elected, is also God's Son. The difference is that Israel did not live up to being God's son in terms of righteousness, obedience, and morality. But Jesus did. In other words, Jesus demonstrated in his obedience what Israel should have been. The contrast was between a son of God, Israel, who had been disobedient, and a son of God, Jesus, who had been wondrously obedient. It turns out that the writer of the Gospel of Matthew was a sophisticated interpreter of Scripture. He was aware that a text has multiple implications. No single interpretation exhausts the meaning of a text. The text, as some scholars suggest, is multivalent. Hosea 11, verse 1 is such a text, in that it refers originally to a recalcitrant and wayward son of God, namely Israel, and latterly to an obedient and righteous Son of God, namely Jesus, whose life and work was designed to reverse the effects of Israel's sinful ways. There is a reason why we call Matthew's writing gospel, which of course you realize means good news. This text is good news indeed. I want to encourage you to go to my website, faspina.com, and record there for me your email so that we get ready for our mini courses. I want you to know that I'm in the process right now of drawing up a menu of the first year's mini courses. You'll be able to choose which of them you are interested in, or you can choose to be part of all of them. In any case, go to the website and let me know what your email is. Also, if you have any questions for me to deal with in a subsequent Q&A period, go to my email, fspina106@gmail.com. Thank you. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. One, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. Two, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.